in the book where you say on pages 9 and 10 that whatever the future brings, we need the ability and the tools to operate effectively in a very different world where states still exist and exercise power, but side by side with corporate, civic, and criminal actors enmeshed in a web of networks. This chessboard running up against this web of networks that you talked about. So it is a question of either or. Is it that you're a realist and therefore you're just playing on the chessboard, or you're an idealist and you're just playing in the web and then the networks? Or is it a question of both and how do you see that? And how should the reader enter into the book on this debate, which goes back decades and decades among practitioners and students of the field that you and I have both come out of?
Yeah, it's definitely both and indeed, the endless debates between realists and liberal internationalists about do we pursue our interests or do we pursue our values. Those are, I think you and I would both agree, often overplayed. I strongly believe, for instance, that we have to pursue our values. That's part of our interests. But I would also say I would also say that we have to be able to put together chessboard strategies and web strategies. And often it's a question of shorter term and long term. So when you have an immediate crisis with another state, so if you're thinking about the Middle East and you're thinking about what do we do with Iran or what do we do about Syria, there's going to be an immediate set of choices that are going to involve other states. We push back, we try to cooperate, we signal our willingness to cooperate. Sometimes that works, sometimes we don't. But longer term, and if you think about President Obama's speech in 2009, A New Beginning with the Muslim World, to really address the causes of terrorism and indeed lots of other problems coming out of the Middle East, you need to build networks of entrepreneurs, networks of civic groups, networks of scientists, networks of actually Muslim groups that are pushing back against a radical Islamist narrative. And that's where the web strategies come in, and that's where you bring in business and civic groups and governments, and you design a network a particular way and you run it. So it really is both and.
Makes a lot of sense. The question that leads me to raise, I think, is something that you call on page 37 of the book, the disaggregation of the state. Which, as you just said, have been arguing since 1994 as you've been looking at these networks. You say that the proliferation of these networks is the result of what I call the disaggregation of the state, meaning that different parts of governments were peeling away from the chessboard model of foreign policy directed by the head of state and the foreign ministry, and instead creating networks of both private and civic actors. The question I have is, as we're watching debates play out now, debates here in this country that really fueled I would argue, the election of President Trump, among the things he still argues as president, but then argued as candidate, was that a need to return American sovereignty to America, and the ongoing debate that we see even most recently in the French election for president, where one candidate was arguing very much to pull back from the European Union in an argument she made at the time to reassert French sovereignty. One candidate, the winner ultimately, arguing that French interests are best served by more aggressively engaging that network of the European Union. What's your sense of kind of where this ebb and flow goes as it relates to the arc of this debate and the development of these networks since '94, when you started, as you said, making these arguments and really digging into this?
That's a great question. And in a way, again, it goes back to both and. I actually, in the book, I reprint that famous picture. You look at it and do you see an old lady or a young woman? And some of us look at it and say, oh, it's an old lady. See the big nose and the wart, and that's clearly what it is.
I was wondering,
say,
I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask about that because I saw the young lady, so I didn't know if that says something about me or what. But anyway, I thought.
Well, you know, I'm going to leave that to you and your wife. But some of us see the young lady,
Fair
and
enough.
some of us see the old woman.
Fair enough.
But my point is, you actually have to see both. And that to do foreign policy effectively, you must be able to kind of toggle between them. Because in some cases, the state needs to be unitary, right? If we're under attack, that's no time for different government agencies and different citizens and different corporations to be networking around the world. In those situations, you know, the president is the commander-in-chief, and the secretary of state and the secretary of treasury. Everybody's got to be on the same page. So, you know, when we are really under threat, and again, I would say dealing with North Korea right now, or again, when you were working with Iran, there were many different contacts through the government. The Department of Energy played a very important role, the State Department, the Defense Department, but it was what I would call a unitary state. There was somebody in charge and everybody was on the same playbook. At the same time, we have, in a globalized world, an interdependent world, our networks are a great source of power and advantage for the United States. The fact that our corporations are doing business around the world, the fact that our movies and our entertainment are seen around the world, the fact that our universities are attracting students from all over the world and running campuses abroad. And again, our civic organizations linking up to networks abroad. We've got to be able to do both. And that second, you know, disaggregated state's a very academic term, but it means, for instance, that you know, our cities and our states are able to engage others. So right now on climate change, California and the cities of New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, they all are actively networking with their counterparts abroad to fight climate change, but because they can do things on the ground. Or similarly, if you're fighting terrorism, again, you want the ability to help build educational institutions and businesses in states that don't have opportunity for youth to fight the long-term causes of terrorism. So it's really, you got to toggle back and forth. Some of the time you need to be really a unitary, all hands on deck, crisis or conflict state. And in other cases, it's critically important that we stay open to the world and able to participate in networks.